Cynthia leaned in, her gaze fixed intently on Victor, who sat across from her with a confident grin. They had been meeting in secluded spots like this for months, their affair carefully concealed in the city's upscale corners. The gentle hum of conversations and the soft clinking of silverware filled the elegant restaurant, candlelight flickering on polished tables and casting shadows against the walls. "Don't worry," she murmured, swirling the wine in her glass. "It's only a matter of time before everything falls into place." Victor's eyes sparkled as he reached for her hand, his touch familiar and warm. "You know I'd give you everything," he said smoothly. "You deserve more than he could ever offer." Cynthia's smile faltered briefly as she curled her fingers around his, absorbing the weight of his words. "He's been good to me," she admitted softly, "but with you, it's different. I feel alive, free." Their hands intertwined, and for a moment, nothing else mattered. Then, out of the corner of her eye, she noticed a figure standing frozen at the restaurant's entrance. Her heart stopped. Daniel, her son, stood there, his eyes wide with shock and disbelief. He was supposed to be at university, miles away. His face was pale, a storm of anger and confusion crossing his expression. Mom. Daniel's voice was strained, the single word hitting her like a punch. Cynthia's heart pounded wildly, panic sweeping over her. Without thinking, she pulled her hand from Victor's, pushed her chair back, and stood up. "Daniel," she called, trying to steady her voice as she moved toward him, scrambling for an excuse, an explanation. She grabbed his arm, guiding him away from the crowded dining area and toward a quiet corner near the restrooms. In the dim light, Daniel's glare was piercing, his jaw clenched, fists tight at his sides. He waited, silent. "Listen," Cynthia began, her voice unsteady. "This isn't what it seems. It's complicated." Daniel crossed his arms, his stare hard. "What's complicated about you cheating on Dad?" His blunt words made her flinch, a sick feeling twisting in her stomach. "It's not that simple, Daniel. Your father and I... We've had issues for a long time," she tried to explain. "That's your excuse," he shot back, his voice rising. "Problems? So you sneak around behind his back." Cynthia stepped closer, lowering her voice, trying to regain control. "Please don't tell your father about this." Daniel's eyes filled with disbelief. "And why shouldn't I?" Her mind raced, searching for anything that would keep him quiet. "Because," she stammered, "I'll make sure you have everything you want, anything you've ever dreamed of. Cars, money, whatever you need. I'll take care of it. You like nice things, right? I can give you a new life, a new dad, someone rich who could give you everything." For a long moment, Daniel just stared, his expression unreadable, and Cynthia couldn't tell if he was considering her offer or preparing to walk out and expose everything. The silence between them stretched painfully. "You think that's what I want?" he finally asked, his voice bitter. "To be bought off? To have some rich guy replace the dad who actually cares about me?" Cynthia swallowed hard, her throat dry. "I'm just trying to make things right." Daniel laughed, cold and sharp. "You can't fix this. You ruined it." He took a step back, shaking his head. "You're selfish, Mom. All you care about is what you want." Tears pricked at Cynthia's eyes, but she held them back. "That's not true. I'm doing this for us." "No," Daniel replied, his voice now calm but unyielding. "You're doing it for you. You didn't think about Dad or me. You didn't care what this would do to us." She reached out, desperate to hold on to something, anything. "Daniel, please. I can make this right. Just give me a chance. Don't tell your father. I can fix it all." He glanced at her hand but didn't take it. He stood there for a moment, unreadable, then turned and walked away without a word. "Daniel," she called after him, but he didn't stop. She stood frozen, watching helplessly as he disappeared through the restaurant's doors, the sound of them closing echoing painfully in her ears. Her whole body felt numb as she leaned against the wall, her mind racing. What would he do? Was he going to tell Anthony? Was her marriage over? The life she'd been carefully balancing now seemed to be crashing down, spiraling beyond her control. Taking a deep breath, Cynthia wiped her eyes, trying to steady herself before returning to the table where Victor was waiting. He looked up at her, concern etched across his face as she approached. "Is everything okay?" he asked cautiously. She forced a smile that barely held. "Yes," she lied. "Just a little family matter." Victor nodded. Though he continued to watch her, Sensing something was wrong, he reached for her hand again, but this time she didn't respond, her mind far too consumed by what had just happened. As the night dragged on, Cynthia couldn't shake the dread that filled her. Daniel knew, and if he told Anthony, there would be no coming back. The future she had envisioned with Victor could vanish in an instant, and for the first time she understood how fragile it all truly was. After Daniel's departure, Cynthia barely managed to keep herself composed, her heart racing, her son's devastated expression seared into her memory. Victor had noticed something was wrong, but she brushed it off with a hurried excuse about a family emergency. They paid the bill quickly and left, with Victor offering to drive her to his place so she could clear her mind. But Cynthia's thoughts were a chaotic mess, drowning out his words of reassurance. "Are you sure everything's all right?" Victor asked as they sped through the city. His hand rested on her thigh, though she barely noticed. "It's fine," she muttered, her mind racing with fear. What would Daniel do? Had he already told Anthony? Guilt gnawed at her, but she pushed it away. She couldn't afford to lose control now. Victor glanced at her, noticing her discomfort. "If you want, I could talk to him," he offered. "Maybe help him understand." "No," Cynthia said quickly, turning to him. "Let me handle this myself." When they reached Victor's penthouse, Cynthia's phone buzzed from inside her purse. She glanced at the screen, a message from Anthony. "We need to talk." Her heart sank. It was already too late. "I need to go home," Cynthia said suddenly, her tone sharper than she'd intended. Victor gave her a puzzled look. "Now? It's late and you're stressed. Stay the night. We can talk in the morning." Shaking her head, she started gathering her things. "No, I have to go. I need to fix this before it gets worse." Victor didn't argue further. He watched her leave, worry evident in his gaze, but Cynthia was already consumed by the problems waiting for her back at home. The drive felt endless, though her house was only a short distance away. Cynthia's mind raced, replaying her encounter with Daniel and all the ways he could have revealed the truth to Anthony. As she pulled into the driveway, the streetlights illuminated her house, appearing normal yet feeling anything but. The place was dark, no lights were on inside. Anthony always left a light on, even when they'd argued. A wave of anxiety churned her stomach as she got out of the car, clutching her purse as she hurried up the walkway. The flickering porch light cast long shadows, amplifying her unease. She reached for the doorknob and twisted it locked. Cynthia frowned. They never locked the door when one of them was out. Her heart began pounding as she fumbled through her bag for her keys, her pulse racing faster. She located the house key and slid it into the lock, but it wouldn't turn. "What the hell?" she muttered, pulling the key out and trying again, jiggling it in frustration. Panic flared. The locks had been changed. "Anthony," she called out, pounding on the door. "Anthony, open up. What's going on?" No answer. "Daniel," she shouted, her voice breaking as she knocked harder, but silence filled the night. She stepped back, confused and afraid. Just as she was about to try again, the door swung open. Daniel stood there, his face expressionless, his gaze unreadable. "What's going on?" Cynthia stammered, her voice rising in fear. She tried to step inside, but Daniel blocked her way. "Dad knows," he said, his voice flat. Her heart dropped. "Daniel, please, you didn't," she started, but he cut her off. He shoved a stack of papers into her hands. Cynthia looked down, eyes wide. Divorce papers. Her knees nearly buckled, but she steadied herself. No, this can't be happening. You didn't mean this. You don't understand." "I understand perfectly," Daniel replied icily. "I understand that you lied to us, that you betrayed Dad and me." Cynthia's breath hitched. She tried to respond, to find the right words, but none came. She looked at Daniel, searching his face for any hint of compassion, any sign of the son she had raised, but she only saw resentment and disappointment. "This isn't right," she whispered. "It can't be." Daniel ignored her words. "This," he said, holding out a small, neatly wrapped box, "is from Dad." The package seemed harmless, almost like a gift. Her fingers shook as she accepted it. "What is this?" she asked, her voice quivering. "Open it," Daniel said, stepping aside. Cynthia's hands trembled as she tore at the wrapping paper, revealing a velvet box. She opened the lid slowly. Inside was a blood-stained handkerchief wrapped around something cold and metallic. Her breath caught as she peeled back the fabric, a small, sharp blade engraved with Victor's initials. She let out a strangled gasp, stumbling back in horror. Her mind reeled. How did Anthony have this? How did he know about Victor? Her legs gave way, and she collapsed onto the cold porch, her world collapsing around her. The box slipped from her hands, and the blade clattered to the ground. Daniel stood above her, unmoved. Dad thought it was fitting, he said calmly. You can give it to Victor the next time you see him. Cynthia shook her head, tears streaming down her face. Daniel, please, don't do this. He stared at her, his expression cold and distant. I never wanted a rich new dad, Mom. I love the one I already have. But I do want a new mom, and Dad agrees. Cynthia's chest tightened as she reached out, desperate to hold on to him, to pull him back somehow. But Daniel stepped away, leaving her on the porch, her life in ruins. The door clicked shut behind him, and the silence that followed was overwhelming. Clutching the divorce papers, the blade, and the shattered memories of her life, Cynthia felt the weight of everything she'd lost. The locks had been changed, along with everything else. The house had never felt so empty or still. After Cynthia stormed off that night, Anthony remained seated at the kitchen table, staring down at the divorce papers. He hadn't signed them yet, not because he had lingering feelings, but because it felt surreal. 25 years of marriage reduced to a few pieces of paper. The betrayal struck him harder than he could have imagined. He had always trusted her, had always believed in the life they had built together. Across from him, Daniel sat, arms folded, his face set in an expression that made him appear older than his 25 years. The silence between them was heavy until Daniel finally spoke, his voice hard. She didn't deserve you. Anthony sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. No, she didn't, he replied quietly. But it's over now. There's nothing left to save. Daniel's jaw tightened. It's not over. Not yet. He leaned forward, his voice dark with determination. She hurt you, Dad. She doesn't just get to walk away with him like nothing happened. Anthony raised an eyebrow, studying his son's expression. What are you talking about? Daniel's eyes darkened with anger as he recalled his encounter at the restaurant. She tried to bribe me, Dad. Offered me a new, rich dad in exchange for my silence, like I'd sell you out for cash and a fancy car. Anthony's eyes widened in disbelief. She tried to bribe you. Daniel nodded, his expression grim. Yeah, she thinks she and that guy are untouchable because of their money, but they're not. We can make them feel it. Anthony leaned back, thoughtful as he processed Daniel's words. And what exactly are you suggesting? Daniel glanced at the divorce papers on the table, then back at his father. For years, you've given her everything, Dad. She's lived off your hard work, your money, your love. And now she wants to take it all and leave with him? No way. She doesn't get to walk away unscathed. Anthony frowned. I don't want to stoop to her level, Daniel. I'm not going to play dirty. Daniel's voice was steady as he replied. I'm not saying we play dirty. I'm saying we play smart. We know how she thinks. She's greedy, selfish, arrogant. She made her move. Now it's our turn. Anthony looked at him, both impressed by and unsure of his son's resolve. What exactly do you have in mind? We hit them where it hurts most, Daniel said, leaning in. In their wallets. Victor might be rich, but his reputation is everything to him. He built his business on his name, on his image as this honest, successful guy. If that image were tarnished. Anthony's brow furrowed. You mean going after his business? Exactly, Daniel nodded. Nobody amasses that kind of wealth without making enemies or cutting corners. There's dirt on him somewhere. We just need to find it. Anthony hesitated, conflicted. I don't know, son. I don't want to get tangled up in something shady. Daniel leaned back, crossing his arms again, his face set with resolve. It's not shady if we're just bringing the truth to light. He deserves to lose everything after what he's done. And as for Mom, Daniel paused, his voice rising with anger. She needs to know what it feels like to have everything she thought she owned taken away. Anthony rubbed his temples, trying to process it all. Part of him wanted to let it go, to move forward without being trapped by resentment. But another part, the part that had been humiliated and blindsided by Cynthia's betrayal, wanted justice. And how do we even start something like this, he asked. I've already started, Daniel replied, a slight smirk appearing. I've been watching Victor's business moves for a while. He's not as clean as he pretends to be. I have a contact who can dig deeper, find his weak spots. Anthony looked at his son, surprised yet proud. Daniel had always been clever, but he had never seen this side of him. You really thought this through? Of course, Daniel replied. I'm not going to let her destroy our family and then walk away with everything you worked for. Anthony was silent for a long time, thinking. Daniel's plan wasn't without merit. If they could uncover Victor's shady dealings, it would deal a blow that neither he nor Cynthia could recover from. But it was risky, and Anthony wasn't the type to seek revenge. And if this backfires, he asked, what if they come after us? They won't, Daniel assured him. We'll be cautious, and we'll do it right. Besides, if we play it smart, they won't even see it coming. Anthony sighed, weighing his options. For years, he'd been the steady one, the one who always took the high road. But maybe, just this once, it was time to fight back, to show Cynthia that actions had consequences. All right, he finally said, his voice firm. Let's do it. Let's take him down. Daniel smiled, a glint of satisfaction in his eyes. You won't regret this, Dad. Anthony rose from the table, feeling a rush of energy he hadn't felt in days. For the first time since Cynthia's betrayal, he felt like he was in control of his life again. We start tomorrow, he said. But we do it carefully. No mistakes. Agreed, Daniel nodded, standing up as well. We'll make sure they never see it coming. As they left the kitchen, Anthony felt an unexpected sense of relief. This plan wasn't about revenge for revenge's sake, it was about reclaiming what was his, about showing Cynthia and Victor they couldn't destroy him and escape without consequences. Tomorrow, the real battle would begin. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of action for Anthony and Daniel. What started as a vague idea of revenge quickly became a well-planned campaign. They spent late nights in Anthony's home office, reviewing documents, making calls, and building a strategy that would not only expose Victor's corruption but ruin him completely. Anthony had never thought of himself as vengeful, but after what Cynthia had done, something inside him had snapped. His life had been shattered, his trust destroyed, and the idea of letting them leave unscathed felt impossible. Daniel, for his part, was driven by his own anger, not just for how Cynthia had hurt his father, but for how she had tried to manipulate him into silence. One evening, Daniel sat at the kitchen table with his laptop open in front of him. I found it, he said, eyes scanning the screen. Anthony looked up from a stack of old business files. Found what? Victor's dirty little secret, Daniel said, tapping a few keys and turning the screen to face his father. He's been embezzling from one of his companies for years. Offshore accounts, shell companies, it's all here. Anthony leaned forward, staring at the documents on the screen. How did you get this? Daniel grinned slightly. I told you, I have a contact who's good at digging up dirt. It wasn't easy, but once we knew where to look, it all came together. Anthony's eyes narrowed as he read through the files. Victor had been secretly siphoning money from his own company, hiding it in offshore accounts to avoid taxes and inflate his profits. If this information went public, it would ruin him. His entire business empire rested on the image of success, and one crack in that foundation would bring it all down. This is it, Anthony said quietly, the weight of the moment settling over him. This is what we've been waiting for. Daniel nodded. We just need to make sure it gets into the right hands. Once the authorities see this, Victor's finished. Anthony sat back in his chair, exhaling slowly. And Cynthia? We're working on her too, Daniel replied, closing the laptop and standing up. I've been talking to some of her so-called friends. It didn't take much to get them talking, you know how they love to gossip. I spread a few rumors about her affair with Victor, and now it's spreading like wildfire. Anthony raised an eyebrow. How far has it spread? Far enough, Daniel said. It's not just her social circle anymore. It's reached her workplace, her charity events everywhere. She's being blacklisted left and right. People don't want to be associated with her now that they know she destroyed her own family. Anthony felt a pang of guilt at the thought of Cynthia being ostracized, but it passed quickly. She had made her choices, and now she was facing the consequences. He couldn't afford to feel sorry for her, not after what she had done. And Victor, Anthony asked, how's he handling all of this? Daniel smirked. Not well. His assets are frozen, and he's trying to figure out who's behind it all. But every time he makes a move, we're 2 steps ahead. His lawyers are scrambling to protect him, but they don't even know what they're up against. Anthony nodded slowly, feeling a growing sense of satisfaction. For the first time in weeks, he felt like he was in control again. Good. Let him sweat. The next morning, Anthony sat in his office, staring at his phone. Daniel's contact was about to make the first call to the authorities, a crucial step that would set everything in motion. Once Victor's embezzlement was exposed, his world would come crashing down. But as Anthony waited for the call, a flicker of doubt crept in. Was this really the right thing to do? Revenge had consumed so much of his energy over the past few weeks, but now that the moment was here, he hesitated. He had never been a vengeful person. He'd always believed in taking the high road. But the pain Cynthia had caused was too deep. The thought of letting them escape unscathed was unbearable. His phone buzzed, pulling him from his thoughts. He picked it up and saw Daniel's name on the screen. "It's done," Daniel said when Anthony answered. "Already?" Anthony asked, his heart racing. "Yeah. The call's been made. They're going to start looking into Victor's finances. It won't take long before everything comes to light." Anthony leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. "Good." There was a pause on the other end of the line before Daniel's voice came through. "You okay, Dad?" Anthony hesitated, considering. "Just thinking." "About what?" "It's about whether we're doing the right thing." Daniel was silent for a moment before responding. "They deserve this, both of them. We're not the bad guys here." "I know," Anthony replied softly. "It's just difficult. I never imagined we'd end up here." "I didn't either," Daniel admitted. "But here we are, and they need to face the consequences of what they did to us." Anthony nodded, even though Daniel couldn't see it. "You're right." They hung up, and Anthony sat quietly for a few minutes, looking out the window. He understood the necessity of their actions, but that didn't make it any easier. He had loved Cynthia once they had built a life together, raised their son together. But now that life was over, and there was no turning back. A few days later, the fallout began. Victor's business was struck hard as the financial misconduct came to light. His reputation was dragged through the mud in the press, and his investors began pulling their funds. Lawsuits followed, and in just a few weeks, his once thriving empire lay in ruins. He tried to contain the damage, to fight back, but it was already too late. The trap had closed, and he was caught. Meanwhile, Cynthia found herself increasingly isolated. Rumors of her affair spread rapidly, spiraling out of her control, and soon, even her closest friends began avoiding her. Her job was on the line, her social status in shambles, and no matter what she tried, she couldn't stop the bleeding. Every attempt to regain control was thwarted, every move countered and anticipated, as though someone was guiding her and Victor's downfall from the shadows. No matter how much they searched, they couldn't figure out who was behind it, and that was precisely how Anthony and Daniel wanted it. The trap was set, and Cynthia and Victor were now paying the price. Cynthia stood outside Victor's opulent penthouse, gripping her phone tightly. The screen showed dozens of missed calls from her lawyer, each voicemail more distressing than the last. She could feel her carefully built life disintegrating beneath her. She shoved the phone into her coat pocket and pressed the doorbell. The familiar chime echoed through the hallway, but it no longer offered her any comfort. When Victor finally opened the door, he looked like he hadn't slept in days. His hair was disheveled, his suit wrinkled, and the confident gleam in his eyes had faded. "Where have you been?" he demanded, his voice strained. He glanced past her into the hallway, as though expecting to be watched. "I've been calling you." "Where do you think I've been?" Cynthia snapped, brushing past him into the penthouse. The cool air inside hit her face, but it did nothing to ease the turmoil within. "Everything's falling apart, Victor." "I know," he muttered, closing the door. "You think I don't know that?" Cynthia stood in the center of the living room, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. The penthouse, once a symbol of the new life she had envisioned with Victor, now felt like a gilded cage. It had been their retreat, a haven from the chaos of their affair, but now it served only as a reminder of how quickly everything had been ripped away. "They froze our accounts," Cynthia said, her voice shaking. Do you understand what that means? We're left with nothing." Victor paced back and forth, running a hand through his hair. "I had no idea they had this much on me," he spat, frustration seeping into his tone. "Someone's been digging into my business for months, Cynthia. This isn't just bad luck, someone's orchestrating this." Cynthia's heart hammered in her chest. The realization had gnawed at her for days, ever since the rumors started, ever since her world began to collapse. Taking a deep breath, she whispered, almost as if saying it aloud would make it more real, "It's Anthony." Victor stopped in his tracks, turning to look at her, eyes narrowing. "What?" She swallowed, her throat dry. "It's Anthony. He's doing this. He and Daniel know everything. I saw the way Daniel looked at me that night at the restaurant. He didn't just see me with you, Victor. He knew. They both knew." Victor's expression hardened with fury. So they'd been planning this all along. Cynthia nodded, feeling the weight of it bearing down on her. "I think so. They're behind everything, the rumors, the frozen accounts, the investigation. They've been playing us." Victor clenched his fist and struck the wall in frustration. "Then we fight back," he snarled, his voice growing louder. "I won't let them get away with this." "It's too late," Cynthia replied, her throat tightening. "The lawyers are saying there's nothing we can do. Anthony's been too careful. We can't trace any of it back to him." Victor's eyes flashed with desperation. "There has to be something. They can't just destroy me like this. I've worked too hard for everything I have." "And what about everything I've lost?" Cynthia snapped, her voice sharp with anger. "My life is ruined. My reputation is destroyed. I've lost all my friends. And now I've lost you too, all because of that family." Victor turned to her, his face contorted with rage. "This isn't just about you, Cynthia. Do you know how many people rely on me? My company, my employees, they've destroyed everything I've built." Cynthia took a step closer, her voice trembling with a mixture of anger and fear. "And you promised we'd be fine. You said we'd be better off together. Look where we are now, Victor. I left my family, my whole life, and for what? For this." She gestured around the penthouse, which now felt cold and empty, a hollow shell of what it once represented. Victor clenched his fists, his jaw set tightly. "I didn't know it would turn out like this." Tears filled Cynthia's eyes, but she refused to let them fall. "And now what? What are we supposed to do?" "Now what, Victor? Do we run? Hide?" "There's nothing left for us," Cynthia demanded. Victor didn't reply. He turned away, staring out over the city through the expansive windows in the living room. The skyline stretched out, glittering in the distance, but it seemed far, almost unreachable. The life he'd built, his empire, was slipping from his grasp, and he had no idea how to save it. "We fight," he muttered, though even he heard the emptiness in his words. They no longer held any conviction. "It's over," Victor, Cynthia said, shaking her head. "They've won." A long silence hung between them, broken only by the faint hum of the city below. Cynthia felt the crushing weight of it all on her chest. This was supposed to be their fresh start, a new life together, but it was all reduced to ruins. Suddenly, Victor's phone buzzed on the coffee table. He glanced at it and swore under his breath. "They've initiated a full audit of my company," he said, his voice tight with anger. "I'm under investigation for financial fraud. This is the end. Cynthia, there's no way back from this." Cynthia stared at him, feeling the gravity of his words sink in. "So, this is it?" Victor didn't answer, but the look on his face said it all. He was out of options, he had no tricks left. Anthony and Daniel had trapped them, outmaneuvering them at every turn. Cynthia sank down onto the couch, her hands trembling. "What do we do now?" she asked softly. Victor sighed, rubbing his temples, as if trying to lessen the constant headache that had been building. "We survive," he murmured, though it wouldn't be the life they had planned. Cynthia nodded, the weight of her choices pressing down on her. She'd left everything behind for a future with Victor, but now that future was gone, and there was no going back. She had risked everything for this affair and lost it all. What was once a sanctuary now felt like a cage, and for the first time she understood how far she had fallen. As the reality set in, they both sat in silence, realizing there was no escaping the consequences of their actions. They had lost everything: money, respect, and the trust of those they had betrayed. Months had passed since the chaos that tore Anthony's world apart, and as he stood in the living room of his new home, a small smile tugged at his lips. The house was smaller, cozier than the one he had shared with Cynthia, but the size didn't matter anymore. It was a place of peace, a sanctuary free from the shadows of the past. Soft morning light filtered through the windows, casting a gentle glow over the warm, simple decor. It was a home filled with life and, most importantly, hope. Anthony sipped his coffee, looking around with a sense of contentment he hadn't felt in years. A light sound of footsteps echoed from the hallway, and Daniel appeared, holding another cup of coffee. He handed it to his father with a grin. "Here you go, Dad. Thought you might need a refill." Anthony chuckled, accepting the cup. "You know me too well." Daniel settled into a chair across from him, leaning back with a relaxed ease that hadn't been there during the turmoil months ago. For both of them, this was a fresh beginning. They had been through hell together, but they had come out stronger, their bond unshakable and built on trust. "You've done so much for me," Anthony said, glancing at his son. "I don't think I'd be here if it weren't for you." Daniel shook his head. "We did this together. You taught me what loyalty means. I couldn't just sit back and let her destroy you." Anthony sighed, a hint of old pain surfacing for a moment. "I never saw it coming. I thought I knew her." "That's what makes it so painful," Daniel said gently. "But you don't have to carry that anymore. You've moved forward, we both have." Anthony smiled, the lines around his eyes softening. He looked out at the backyard, where a light breeze rustled the trees. "It's strange. After everything, I thought I'd feel empty, but I just feel free."
At that moment, Laura entered the room, carrying a basket of freshly folded laundry. Her presence filled the space with warmth. She was a woman who had come into Anthony's life in his darkest days, offering support when he needed it most. What started as a friendship, a comforting presence, had grown into something much deeper.
"Laundry's done," Laura announced with a light tone, setting the basket down and coming over to Anthony, resting a gentle hand on his shoulder. "How are you two this morning?" "Much better with this coffee," Anthony replied with a grin, lifting his cup. Daniel glanced between the two of them with a knowing smile. "I'm heading out to give you some time," he said, standing up and giving his father's shoulder a pat. "You've earned it." Anthony watched Daniel leave, pride swelling in his chest. His son had grown into a man he was proud of, a man who had stood by him through the darkest times. As the front door closed behind Daniel, Anthony turned to Laura, who had taken a seat beside him. "How are you feeling about the move?" she asked, her eyes filled with both concern and understanding. Anthony took a deep breath, looking around the house. "I feel good. For the first time in a long time, I feel like I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be." Laura smiled, her hand still resting on his arm. "You deserve this peace, Anthony. You've been through so much." He gazed at her, his heart full of gratitude. "I wouldn't have made it through without you, Laura. You were there when I couldn't find my own strength." She shook her head softly. "You've always been strong, Anthony. I just reminded you." Their hands intertwined, and for a moment, they sat in comfortable silence, knowing that this moment, right here, was their new beginning. Meanwhile, miles away in a cold, empty apartment, Cynthia sat alone by the window. Her hollow eyes stared out, her face pale as she looked at a world that had moved on without her. The once luxurious surroundings she had shared with Victor now felt empty, devoid of the excitement she once craved. Victor was nowhere to be seen, off fighting legal battles he was bound to lose. The investigation into his business had exposed every secret Anthony and Daniel had uncovered, tearing down his empire and their shared life. They were living in the shadow of their choices, and all that remained was a bitter regret. Cynthia sighed, her thoughts drifting back to the family she had abandoned. She had thought she was chasing freedom, excitement, something more than what she had with Anthony. But in the end, she had only destroyed the stability she'd always had. Her thoughts turned to Daniel, her son. She remembered the look in his eyes the night he had caught her with Victor. He had been the first to see her for what she had become, the first to leave. And Anthony, he had moved on, found happiness, and rebuilt a life that no longer included her. The irony wasn't lost on her in searching for something better. She had ended up with nothing. The life she had imagined with Victor, full of wealth and glamour, had turned to ashes. A knock on the door pulled her from her thoughts. It was Victor, looking as defeated as she felt. "They've taken everything," he said quietly, not even closing the door behind him. "We're finished." Cynthia didn't respond. There was nothing left to say. Back at Anthony's new home, the sun was setting, casting a golden glow over the yard. Anthony stood with Laura on the back porch, watching the trees sway gently in the breeze. For the first time in years, he felt the weight of the past lift, leaving in its place a sense of hope. "I never thought I'd be here," Anthony murmured, his arm around Laura's waist. "But I'm glad I am." Laura leaned her head on his shoulder. "So am I." Together, they watched the sun dip below the horizon, knowing that this was the beginning of something beautiful. The past was finally behind them, and in its place was a future filled with peace, love, and new beginnings.